Good evening, everyone. Just before we start, some housekeeping rules. Emergency exits are on this side. But good evening, everyone, again. And thank you for joining us today to the screening of Under Fire, Israel's War on Medics, produced by Middle East Eye, which will be followed by a panel discussion. I am Dania Abul Hajj, a lawyer with the International Center of Justice for Palestinians. As we are gathered here tonight, the Palestinian population in Gaza continues to be annihilated by Israel through all available means. Israel's destruction of essential infrastructure in Gaza has continued unabated. And nowhere is this more obvious than the destruction of the healthcare infrastructure. Every hospital in Gaza has been attacked by Israeli forces and has been damaged, destroyed, or either rendered completely dysfunctional. Aid workers and healthcare workers have been deliberately attacked, killed, and injured. Israel's destruction of the medical sector is a critical component of Israel's ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Come to me, Dad, help me. We were targeted by the Israelis, and they are now shooting at us directly. These were the last words of Muhammad, one of the 15 emergency and rescue workers whose fate would remain unknown for over a week until permission was granted by the Israeli military for other rescue workers to go into Rafah and uncover a horrific scene. A mass grave containing the bodies of the 15 first responders buried along with their crushed emergency vehicles. But this is not one isolated incident. This is one of the numerous crimes committed by Israel against humanitarian workers over the past 18 months. These crimes are not hidden. They are known to the world. And yet, 18 months later, Israel continues to carry them out with complete impunity. But there are also stories that are less known. A few months ago, I met with Gazans who were evacuated for medical treatment, genocide survivors. Amongst those, I met with a doctor who worked in the north of Gaza until his evacuation. I hope God forgives me. I hope God forgives me for leaving. I should have never left, he told me. His words still haunt me till this day. And I often wonder how genocide survivors continue to be consumed with survivors' guilt. Today's documentary film reports on the work of paramedics on the front line, capturing their harrowing experiences as they risk their lives to save others. This film sheds light on Israel's targeting of healthcare infrastructure and rescue teams in both Gaza and Lebanon, despite their protection under international law, revealing the devastating toll of the attacks on emergency services. Today, as we watch this documentary, we pay tribute to the immense resilience and the remarkable steadfastness of humanitarian and medical workers in Gaza and all other Palestinians. Now, I would like to welcome our first keynote speaker, David Hurst, Editor-in-Chief of Middle East Eye, and previously at The Guardian for over 25 years, left it as its foreign lead writer.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me. If you're looking for the real purpose behind the continuation of a war that's lasted 18 months and shows no signs of stopping, I would suggest you don't waste your time charting the twists and turns of Netanyahu's relationship with Ben Gvir or Smotrich. You can discount, too, any serious wish to get the remaining hostages back alive, or indeed any serious hope that it would wipe Hamas off the map. It knows it can't do that. I suggest you look at Israel's meticulously planned premeditated assault on Gaza's 36 hospitals, its paramedics, its ambulances. Israel coldly calculates that if it dismantles the health system, it makes the Strip uninhabitable for over 2 million people. And it could still prove to be right. You can test this assumption in a number of ways. Last autumn, a team of researchers from Harvard plotted the distance between Gaza's hospitals and craters formed by 2,000-pound M84 bombs. These are bombs that Biden temporarily blocked and that Trump have now resupplied in earnest. An M84 bomb can displace 5 tons of dirt and pancake entire buildings. The paper noted that during the first 6 weeks of the conflict, 84% of Gaza's hospitals were within damage range of at least one crater, and 1/4 were within lethal range. So a physician asked Clayton Dalton, a US doctor who entered Gaza 2 weeks after the January ceasefire, how could you be using these kinds of weapons in this kind of setting and still argue you're adhering to international humanitarian law? Dropping more bombs on Gaza in the first 2 months than was dropped on London, Dresden, and Hamburg during the whole of the Second World War turns out to be the least of it. The campaign to dismantle Gaza's healthcare system started on October the 17th, just 10 days after the Hamas attack. A devastating explosion took place in the car park of Al-Ahi Hospital in Gaza City. The Gaza Health Ministry reported that 471 people were killed and 342 people injured, while US intelligence agencies put the number at between 100 and 300. At any rate, the blast was big enough to derail Joe Biden's visit the next day to the region. He had to cancel the Jordan leg of his trip as a result. Now, the first reaction by Israeli officials was to deny responsibility. They said a failed rocket launch by Hamas or Islamic Jihad was responsible for a missile veering off course. They said a salvo of 17 rockets fired from within Gaza were all fired in the direction of the hospital, and one of them was responsible for the blast in the car park. The Israeli military spokesman, Peter Lerner, appeared on CNN and BBC, pointing to a still of an Al Jazeera live stream showing a mid-air explosion and claiming this footage was that of the misfiring rocket. These and other more sophisticated lies, like an alleged audio tape of 2 Arab voices talking about the rocket, they turned out to have accents which were not from Gaza, were quickly unraveled by forensic architecture, Earshot, and Al-Haq, which formed the content of a Channel 4 documentary. But the Israeli tactic worked. Sow enough disinformation and get it spread throughout the world, and Biden will continue to supply your Air Force with those M84 bombs. Al-Ahli showed that Israel can target a hospital against every war convention in existence to which it itself is signatory and get away with it. No one blinked. 6 days before, at the Labour Party conference, Keir Starmer told LBC that Israel had the right to withhold water from Gaza, a line he never apologized for publicly, even after the hospital attack. Israel's right to exact the worst collective punishment on a civilian population since Srebrenica became firmly entrenched in the status quo that exists to this day. It's become normal to kill 30 or 100 civilians a night. After the first 2 massacres took place at Al-Shifa, Ehud Barak, former prime minister, who poses as a peacenik, went on Newsnight to claim that Hamas's headquarters were in the basement under the hospital, and he knew about this basement because Israeli engineers had built it. These claims, again, could not stand serious scrutiny from independent foreigners who had worked in these hospitals. I recommend that everyone reads a really stunning account of a walkthrough of what remains of the hospital system of Gaza by a US doctor in the New Yorker. In the following passage, Clayton Dalton describes his visit to the Indonesian hospital. He writes, "We entered a large storage room in the corner of an ICU, which was crammed with medical devices, ultrasound machines, IV pumps, dialysis machines, blood pressure monitors, each had been apparently destroyed by a bullet, not in a pattern one would expect from random shooting, but rather methodically. I was stunned. I couldn't think of any possible military justification for destroying life-saving equipment. When I asked the IDF for comment, a spokesperson said, claims that the IDF deliberately targets medical equipment are unequivocally false. Another claim was made to have found a stash of weapons near an MRI room in a hospital. As any radiologist will tell you, that machine functions with a powerful magnet. No metal object can be allowed anywhere near it, otherwise it disables it. Today, Israel has stopped even bothering to say that Hamas are using hospitals as human shields, bombing hospitals, columns of ambulances, targeting emergency responders has become an internationally tolerated norm. In Lebanon, as we all see from the film we are about to see, Israel bombed 40 hospitals, 8 of whom were forced to close, and 249 emergency vehicles were damaged. Hundreds of workers were killed. Western governments continue to dance a ballet around this fact. This dance allows them to express deep concern without for one moment stopping to supply Israel with the technology, the intelligence, or the weapons it needs to continue the war. Just listen to the reply a British minister gave to a question from a Liberal MP, Tom Morrison, on the 22nd of April this year. Asked by Morrison whether the government supported international legal action, referrals to the ICC against people responsible for violations of international humanitarian law, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for the Middle East, Hamish Faulkner, replied, the UK is appalled at the recent killings of aid workers and health workers in Gaza. In our diplomatic engagement with the government of Israel and at the UN Security Council, we've called on Israel to conduct thorough investigations to all incidents involving aid workers and medical personnel and ensure accountability for those responsible. Did his boss, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy, ensure accountability of Gideon Saar, the Israeli foreign minister, whom he hosted in London recently? He's a senior member of the Israeli government and part of the cabinet that decided to break the ceasefire agreement with Hamas signed in January. Faulkner went on to say that Britain respected the independence of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and it was for the ICC prosecutor, having reviewed the evidence, to determine independently who should be prosecuted in accordance with his mandate under the Rome Statutes. But when the ICC prosecutor did just that for Netanyahu and the then Defence Minister Gallant, Britain's reaction was to ignore the ruling. Will Faulkner's deep respect for the ICC mean that Britain now honours its obligations under the Rome Statute to arrest and try Netanyahu and anyone else who participated in this war under an arrest warrant that exists from the international prosecutor of the ICC? Of course it doesn't. And another thing happened during Saar's private, secret official visit to the UK, or rather it didn't happen. The UK media ignored all mention of it. The visit passed unnoticed. For Israel's actions in Gaza are only half the story. The other half is supplied by the battalions of journalists and mainstream media organizations who look the other way. There are honest journalists who do their job under impossible conditions. The Middle East Eye, I'm proud to say, now in its 11th year, could not function without them. But most news media organizations quite simply are failing to function. I've worked in a few war zones with the BBC and with Sky crews in Croatia, in Bosnia, in Russia, in Chechnya. I edited much of The Guardian's output during the Second Intifada, and I and my colleagues in the BBC did their job honourably and impartially, as we were all trying to do. We were subject to exactly the same pressures that exist now from exactly the same people. It's not in the DNA of the BBC to be this silent. I can't remember another conflict where their coverage was as incomplete as it is today. You would not know from their coverage that at this very moment, a major battle is taking place in Beit Hanun between Hamas fighters and the Israeli army, because no one's reporting it. The BBC crow that they can't report properly on Gaza or in southern Lebanon because they're not allowed in. But as you'll see from the film, reporters can get in and report, even when bombs are falling. Countless massacres have simply been relegated to a few parts in a sort of he said, she said manner. Their inaction to report the most basic stories helps shroud each massacre in a fog of war. Every time they say the health ministry is Hamas run, or remind their audience that those figures don't make a difference between civilians and fighters, they cast doubt on a death toll which any impartial investigation has revealed is probably a gross underestimate. At least the Lancet thinks so. So when future generations ask you when the liberal democracies lost their moral compass, when they lost their right to be heard as a moral arbiter of right and wrong, one of the answers will surely be that this happened in 2025, and it happened in Lebanon, and it happened in Gaza. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, David, for these valuable remarks. Now, before we move on, can I please ask everyone to move onto the inside in case some people show up late, so it will be easier for them to take their seats. It's a bit of an inconvenience. Thank you, everyone. Now I would like to welcome our second keynote speaker, Professor Abi Shleim, Israeli-British historian and Emeritus Professor of International Relations at Oxford University.
Good evening. We are gathered here to view and then to discuss a film called Under Fire, Israel's War on Medics. I'm not an expert on this particular aspect of the war, so it was agreed that I shall outline the broader political background to Israel's war in Gaza and in Lebanon. Israel is a settler colonial state, and the logic of settler colonialism is the elimination of the natives in order to take over the land and its resources. And this is what Israel is doing, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank as well. Noam Chomsky observed that the most extreme and vicious form of imperialism is settler colonialism. And the Palestinians, for the last century, have been at the receiving end of Zionist settler colonialism on the one hand, backed by Western imperialism, first under Britain and then under America, and today by both. The aim of the Zionist movement from the beginning was to establish a Jewish state on as large a part of historic Palestine as possible, with as few Arabs inside its borders as possible. This is what they are doing today in both Gaza and the West Bank. Israel is not part of the region, and it's never wanted to be part of the region, but Israel has never been as alienated from its regional environment as it is today. In the past, Israeli leaders used to claim that the aim is peaceful coexistence with their neighbors. Today, it's quite clear that Israel's aim is not coexistence, but domination and military supremacy. The present government, headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, is the most right-wing government, chauvinistic, expansionist, violent, overtly racist, messianic, and Jewish supremacist government in Israel's entire history. Ever since the Second Intifada in 2000, Israeli society has been moving steadily to the right, and the composition of the present government reflects this shift to the right. The most influential members of this government after Netanyahu are Bezalel Smotrich, the leader of religious Zionism, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, the leader of Jewish power. Ben-Gvir was a disciple of the fascist Rabbi Kahana, whose party was outlawed, whose party Kach was outlawed. And Ben-Gvir was not accepted to do national service in the IDF because he was considered too extreme. Just imagine, he was too extreme, so extreme, he was not admitted to do national service in the IDF. Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are fascists, they are Jewish fascists, and yet they set the tone for the entire government. Their agenda, which they make no effort to conceal, their agenda is the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and the West Bank, and eventually the formal annexation of the West Bank. Benjamin Netanyahu is not their prisoner. Some people think that he has to go along with them in order to survive politically, but he's as extreme as they are, and he shares their agenda. He has the dubious distinction of being a fugitive from law at home and abroad, because he's on trial in Israel for serious corruption charges, and also, as we heard a minute ago, there is an ICC warrant for his arrest. This government is congenitally incapable of making peace or even sustaining a ceasefire. It is a proponent of permanent conflict and permanent war. Israel claims that it has the right to self-defense, and its Western allies, like Starmer and Lamy, repeat this claim parrot-like. But Israel does not enjoy the right to self-defense, because under international law, you have the right to self-defense if you are attacked by another country. This clearly is not the case. Nor do you have the right to self-defense if the attack comes from an area under your occupation. Nor is this a war between Israel and Hamas. Like its previous 7 military offensives since Kach led in 2008, this is an assault on the whole people of Gaza. The declared aim of this war is the eradication of Hamas, and this aim is clearly unattainable. The real aim is to render the enclave uninhabitable and the ethnic cleansing of the enclave. It used to be fashionable to say that the Gaza Strip is an open-air prison, the biggest open-air prison in the world. But in prison, at least the inmates have physical security, they get water and food, and they get some medical attention. None of these apply in the case of the civilians of Gaza. Israel has turned Gaza into a wasteland and into a mass grave. The carnage and the destruction exceed the total of the last 7 military offensives. Statistics tell only part of the story. The IDF has killed over 50,000 people, and about 18,000 of whom are children. 70% of the casualties are women and children. This is a war on children, and killing children is not an acceptable form of self-defense. Israel has destroyed or damaged or destroyed 70% of the housing in Gaza. The IDF has moved, evacuated, or insisted on the removal of 2 million out of 2.3 million inhabitants of Gaza. Some of them were forced to move 10 times or even more, and many of them, having obeyed the orders to move to so-called safe area, were bombed by the Israeli army. And the forcible removal of civilians, is a war crime that Israel commits every day for the last 18 months. Israel has been committing multiple war crimes in Gaza. Domicide, which is the destruction of houses. Ecocide, which is the destruction of the environment. Econocide, which is the destruction of the economy. And the crime of all crimes, genocide. Israel and its friends, of course, deny the charge of genocide. But the leading Israeli experts on genocide and the Holocaust have said categorically that this is a classic example of genocide. The ICJ, in its ruling on the South African claim, has concluded that South Africa made a plausible case that there is genocide going on in Gaza, and the ICJ issued orders for preliminary orders on Israel to stop the genocide, orders that Israel has repeatedly ignored. But most importantly, the Convention for the Prevention of Genocide defines it as the intent to destroy a racial, ethnic, or religious group in whole or in part. That's the definition. This is precisely what Israel is doing. Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. If this is not genocide, I don't know what is. Another aspect of Israel's crime in Gaza, which is of particular interest to me, is scholasticide. Scholasticide, the systematic destruction of the educational system of a society. And Israel has bombed, damaged, or destroyed all 12 universities in Gaza, all 12 universities without a single exception. Israel has also damaged or destroyed 512 schools. It has killed many, hundreds of academic staff and university staff and thousands of students. I've written an article about scholasticide in Gaza in the Journal of the British Academy, giving a lot more details. I don't need to remind you of the importance of education in Palestinian society, the importance of education for the development of this society. And it is precisely because of the importance of education that Israel is so determined, so vicious in its destruction, in its pursuit of scholasticide in Gaza. Israel's attack on the health system in Gaza has been just as systematic and just as devastating as its attack on the educational system. Dr. Hassan Abu Sitta is here. He is the great expert. He has worked as a surgeon both in Gaza and in Lebanon, and I look forward to hearing what he has to say on the subject in the panel. But for now, I want to make just one point. Israel is killing doctors and nurses and medics and bombing, and at the same time, bombing medical schools in order to prevent the training of new medical staff to replace the ones that it had killed. If this is not genocide, I don't know what is. In Lebanon, Israel is repeating its criminal behavior in Gaza. Its aim is the ethnic cleansing of the South Lebanon, and to this end, it deems it necessary to destroy the health system. The film that we're about to see, Under Fire, Israel's War on Medics, exposes the extreme brutality and savagery. I would say it exposes the sadism of Israel's repeated attacks on the health system in Lebanon. This is not a war just against Hezbollah, but against the whole of Lebanese society. The key point is Israel's refusal to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. The whole of international humanitarian law revolves around this distinction and is designed to protect civilians. Now, a central IDF military doctrine is the Dahiya doctrine, named after the Lebanese village which was devastated by Israel during the Second Lebanon War of 2006. The doctrine calls for the use of massive, disproportionate force and the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. This is clearly a criminal doctrine, and it amounts to a root and branch rejection of the entire body of international humanitarian law. This doctrine helps to explain, but it most certainly does not justify Israel's savage war on the medics in Gaza and Lebanon. Israel's attacks on civilians and of medics as well, medics included, maybe especially medics, are not acts of self-defense, they are acts of state terrorism. To sum up, Israel is a racist and violent settler colonial state. It embodies an extreme form of ethno-nationalism. For the past 18 months, Israel has been conducting a genocidal campaign against the Palestinian people. And in the process, it has shredded to pieces the so-called rule-based international order. Yet, it has not been called to account. It has not been subjected to sanctions. It is getting away literally with murder due to the impotence of the international community and to the active support of its Western allies. America and Britain are not just complicit in Israel's war crimes, they are active partners in these war crimes. So, like Israel, America and Britain are likely to go down on the wrong side of history. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Avi. That was very insightful. Now we will show a recorded message from Dr. Munir al-Burj in Gaza, Director General of the Palestinian Ministry of Health.
السادة الكرام في الميدل إيست الإيفنت المنظم لهذا المؤتمر. الحقيقة نحن في قطاع غزة ومحدثكم الدكتور منير البرج مدير عام وزارة الصحة الفلسطينية. أحدثكم من داخل المستشفى الأندونيسي، هذا المستشفى الذي دمره الاحتلال 3 مرات على 3 مراحل، وأعدنا ترميمه وأعدنا بناءه وتشغيله للمرة الثالثة. منذ أكتوبر تم يعني استشهاد أكثر من 51,000 شهيد في قطاع غزة الذي يسكنه ما يقارب 2,400,000 نسمة. الحقيقة الاحتلال الإسرائيلي استهدف منذ اللحظة الأولى المنظومة الصحية، جعل سياسة ممنهجة لاستهداف المنظومة الصحية، وأنا كنت شاهدا على هذا الاستهداف منذ اللحظة الأولى. تم حصارنا في مستشفى الشفاء وخروجنا من مستشفى الشفاء، بعد ذلك تم حصارنا في هذا المستشفى الأندونيسي، تم حصارنا في مستشفى كمال عدوان، وتم حصار المستشفى المعمداني، ومن ثم انتقل إلى جنوب غزة فحاصر مستشفى ناصر ومستشفى الهلال الأحمر الفلسطيني، مستشفى الأمل، ومستشفى أبو يوسف النجار في رفح، وأيضا مستشفى الهلال الأحمر الإماراتي أيضا في رفح. الحقيقة كانت سياسة ممنهجة مخطط إليها مسبقا، تبدأ بقصف المستشفى وحصاره لأيام وخروج المرضى والمصابين. كان يتواصل معنا الاحتلال الإسرائيلي من أجل إخراج الناس النازحين وإخراج المرضى في ظروف كانت مهينة وتحت إطلاق النار وتحت فوهات البنادق والقناصة الإسرائيلية. الاحتلال قتل داخل المستشفى، وأنا شاهد على هذا الأمر. في هذا المستشفى عندما اقتحمه قتل 2 على أسرة المرضى، إحداهما امرأة كانت من دار شاهين، من عائلة شاهين، وقتلها عندما استنجدت به، فأطلق الرصاص مباشرة عليها وماتت على سرير العلاج. الحقيقة الاحتلال الإسرائيلي منذ بداية الحرب كان قد استهدف المستشفيات. فقدنا ما يقارب 1400 شهيد من كوادرنا الصحية، من بينهم 150 طبيب، 221 ممرض، أعداد كبيرة من الصيادلة والمسعفين. تم اعتقال 360 من كوادرنا الصحية على رأسهم الدكتور حسام أبو صفية. من طواقم الإسعاف والفرق الإنسانية تم قتل أكثر من 1300 شخص. يعني نجدد في وزارة الصحة وقائمين عليها دعوتنا للمجتمع الدولي، دعوتنا لمؤتمركم الكريم، دعوتنا إلى منظمات الصحة العالمية بالتدخل العاجل والفوري لوقف هذا التدهور، وهو تدهور متسارع عندما نعلم أن إسرائيل أو الاحتلال الإسرائيلي يغلق غزة لشهر ونصف الآن، ويمنع دخول الدواء ويمنع دخول الماء. وكما قال يعني وزير الاحتلال نريد أن نمنع عنهم دخول حبة القمح. وأيضا هناك وزير آخر يقول أننا نريد أن نمنع عنهم ضوء الشمس. فهذا الاحتلال الذي يعني أراد عبر هذه السياسة الممنهجة في قتل وتدمير وإبادة جماعية وتطهير عرقي للشعب الفلسطيني يهدف بالأساس إلى التهجير، وأعلن عنه ذلك، يهدف بشكل واضح إلى التهجير، فيريد أن يضيق فيزيد الخناق على شعبنا في غزة ليسهل عليه عملية التهجير. فهو يدمر المستشفيات لإفقاد الناس مقومات الصمود ويسهل عليه عملية التهجير بشكل واضح. فلذلك يعني لابد من تدخل واضح من قبل الجميع، لأن الوضع الحالي هو الأصعب والأشد على غزة. هو واقع، وأنا أشبهه أن غزة يعني تلفظ أنفاسها الأخيرة، لأن الأمور سيكون انعكاساتها ومضاعفاتها بشكل واضح وكبير. سيكون انهيارات في فئات كبيرة جدا، تبدأ في الفئات الهشة، ومن ثم تنتقل إلى الموت الجماعي. وهذا فيه هناك بوادر وهناك مؤشرات، وخاصة عندما نرى هذا الموت في عدد الأطفال بسبب سوء التغذية. هناك أسر فلسطينية يعني تعرضت لمجازر، مسحت بالكامل، ما يقارب 2303 أسر يعني مسحت بشكل كامل من السجل المدني. هناك أسر لم يبقى منها إلا ناجي وحيد، وهذا المصطلح أصبح يعني دارجا. هناك ناجي وحيد، ما يقارب 5307 من هذه الأسر يعني لم يبقى منها إلا ناجي وحيد. نحن من خلالكم يعني نطالب عبر مؤتمركم الحماية الفورية للكوادر الصحية، الحماية للمنشآت الصحية، قبل ذلك وقف إطلاق النار وفتح المعابر مباشرة، وإدخال الإمداد والغذاء والدواء والماء لكل غزة. أيضا بحماية هذه الكوادر الطبية التي لم تستطع ولن تخلع معاطفها البيضاء حتى اللحظة. بارك الله فيكم وشكرا لكم، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
And now I will leave you with the screening of the documentary.
with the civil defense in Nabatea in the south of Lebanon. Emergency workers like these guys have been at the front line of the war with Israel. They're supposed to be protected under international law, but they say that they're being targeted by Israeli forces.
Hussein Jaber is a member of Lebanon's National Civil Defense. Before the ceasefire, this was the most dangerous job in Lebanon.
What happened here?
نحن حاليا موجودين بسوق النبطية التجاري. هيدا الشارع من أوله لآخره عبارة عن مصارف، محلات، عيادات، محلات تجارية، وبالإضافة لقدام شوي هو السوق النبطية القديم وبيتسمى بالسوق العثماني يلي له آلاف السنين موجود.
شو هذه؟
ضربة
قريب؟
بضيع حدنا هون لأنه صوته مش كتير قريب.
عادي تسمعون صوت؟
يس بس احنا مش لازم نطول هون.
The entire area is now a ghost town. And there are similar scenes across the south of Lebanon. It'll take years and billions of dollars to rebuild. The all-out war began in September after Israel exploded hundreds of pages in Lebanon, killing both civilians and members of the Lebanese armed group and political party, Hezbollah. For nearly a year prior, fire was exchanged after Hezbollah responded to Israel's bombardment of Gaza by launching rockets into northern Israel. Since then, 126 Israelis lost their lives and 60,000 were displaced. And in Lebanon, more than 4,000 people have been killed, large parts of the country devastated, and 1.2 million forced out of their homes. In Nabatea, most of those remaining here are first responders and medics who face being attacked even when back at base. Hussein's colleague Naji Fahas was killed during an attack close to their civil defense office.
ب 16/10 تعرضت النبطية لسلسلة كبيرة من الغارات. كان الشهيد ناجي عم يشيك الماء والآلية بشكل عام تيكون عم نتوجه على حريق، وفجأة ما سمعنا إلا ضغط في بس دخان أسود متلي، نفس ما عم نقدر ناخد، كان عم يطلع صوته من بعيد. توجهنا لعنده فوراً، كان موجود بهيدا النقطة، كان عم ينزف كتير، ومشينا فيه على المستشفى. نحن وعلى الطريق تعرضنا لغارة ملاصقة لإلنا، فالإسعاف إذا بدك صورة غريبة بس طارت من محلها ورجعت نزلت وتعرضت لكتير من الشظايا والإحجار.
What were you saying to him when you were taking him to the hospital? Do you remember?
نضل نحكي معه خليك معنا وانت قوي ويلا حنوصل على المستشفى. يمكن هاي العبارات كانت عم تطلع من قلبنا لأن ما بدنا نفارق هيدا الشخص، بس ولكن هيدا كان قدره. نحن بالآخر بننبسط لأنه هو صار بمكان أحسن، لأنه نحن هون موجودين على الأرض بمكان كتير بشع مع عدو كتير بشع ما عم يرحم حدا. من بداية الحرب لليوم صار مستشهد من الدفاع المدني اللبناني بمنطقة الجنوب أكثر من 15 شهيد، وبالرغم من لباسنا لهيدا الدروع والخوذ بس نحن بنعتبر إنه هذا كله ما بيحمي من العدو. واختبرت قبل يعني بضربة مركز فرون اللي هي مركز عضوي تابع لنا، استشهد فيها 3 شباب من الدفاع المدني وانجرح شاب بعده لليوم بالمستشفى، كلهم كانوا لابسين دروع.
The 3 men killed on the 7th of September were Mohammed Hashim, Qasim Bazi, and Abbas Hammoud. Only one person survived, Mohammed Ammasha. He now lives in Lebanon's capital, Beirut, which didn't escape the Israeli bombardment, including on the day we visited him. and Mohammed lives with his wife and 2 children in the predominantly Shia Muslim neighborhood of Dahia, which is also a Hezbollah stronghold. Severe injuries to his abdomen and head has changed his life forever. And despite surviving the bombs in the south, he can't escape them in his own home. Can you talk me through the day that you and your colleagues were attacked? What happened?
عم نطفي ببلد اسمه فرون. بس خلص بلش قصف. استشهد 4 بالمستشفى لبعد 5 يوم. بلش اتذكر مصاريني كلها كانت برا. ما في اي مبرر انه تكشف دفع مال او شو اسمه اسعاف. بيقتل الاطفال وبيقتل بيعمل اي شيء. استنى كنا منطقة مفتوحة يعني مبينة الطريق واضحة كل شيء واضح لا شك صار ما بعد.
The funerals of Mohammed's colleagues were attended by locals and politicians, and a complaint was submitted to the UN Security Council by Lebanon. Israel says it only targets Hezbollah infrastructure and members, and at the time claimed it killed terrorists in Froon. But there's no evidence that the men killed were anything but first responders, and they were clearly marked. Without evidence to the contrary, the attack is an apparent war crime. As well as emergency workers, hospitals have also been hit. Lebanon's health ministry says that during the war, 40 were attacked, with 8 forced to close and 249 emergency vehicles damaged.
When Israel boasts about its intelligence, that it really knows what's happening, not only in streets, but even in apartments, it's very difficult not to see in this a targeted attack.
Do you feel let down by the international community?
I think that the international community let down itself, because at the end of the day, you know, the international humanitarian law is not only for Lebanon, it's not only for Gaza, it is for the whole world. And in my opinion, it is not difficult to see how this might be repeated in any future conflict, especially when the countries who are most vocal in talking about human rights are the ones that are actually supporting these violations by providing the diplomatic cover. And we are moving into practices that might have been common in the 19th century, in the 18th century conflicts, where there were no demarcation between civilians and between combatants.
Why would that happen? Why would any military want to target civilians?
There are two reasons. Either because of the concept of total war, and therefore you need to attack their electricity, you need to attack their healthcare, you need to attack their basic services. The other aspect, which is even darker, is if you consider that this society that's being attacked is below humans. This is a subhuman society. This is a society that is not worthy of international humanitarian law. This conduct, which almost borders on the dehumanization, that is the definition of terrorism.
Lebanon's healthcare system was already in crisis due to the economic crash, the Beirut blast, and COVID-19. The war added to that strain as hospitals became overwhelmed with victims, like 3-year-old Celine, whose entire family was killed. Back in Nabatiyah, Hussein Jaber and his colleagues are on a mission.
في حدا هون؟ حدا عم يسمعنا؟ اطلع انا وعلي جابر هون بهالبنايه، شوف انت بهالبنايه. رح تكون انهار، خليك معي على السمع. يلا اتكل على الله.
The civil defense is now searching this building for any survivors because there was a recent attack and they understand that there might still be people trapped here.
في حدا؟ خلينا نسكر هون الباب. رح نضطر ننسحب لانه خلصنا مهمتنا، الحمد لله العائله منا هون وعملنا مسح لكل البنايه، ما في حدا موجود فيها، والطيران المسير صار كثير واطي، على الاغلب شاف تحركنا واجا، ونحن مضطرين ننسحب لانه ما بيرحم لا اسعاف ولا غير اسعاف، فممكن كثير يكون عم يستهدفنا، بما انه خلصنا مهمتنا خلينا نمشي.
Around 120 kilometers away in the west of Lebanon, paramedics in the Bekaa Valley are facing the same threats. During one of the deadliest days for emergency workers, 15 paramedics and 5 bystanders were killed after Israel bombed a national civil defense center on the 14th of November near the historical city of Baalbek. Some funerals were delayed because bodies of the victims were unrecognizable. Israel has not commented on the attack. Abu Ali is also a paramedic in Baalbek, but he works for the separate Islamic Health Society, a medical civil defense organization affiliated with Hezbollah. He's also come under attack during missions.
بس طلعت الغارة اللي هون أو الوحدة، كنا نحن أول ناس استجبنا لهذا الحادث. نحن وقت اللي وصلنا كان في نحن شفنا جرحى وشهداء كمان بالمكان الموجود اللي هون. بعدنا نحن عم ننزل من السيارة ونزلت الغارة الثانية حق.
Have any of your colleagues also reported a similar pattern where there's a strike and then once the emergency workers arrive there's another strike?
صح، مطرح ثاني كمان نفس الشيء صار معهم هيك، يعني هن وصلوا ونزلوا عم يشيلوا الجريح، عم يحطوه بسيارة الإسعاف، كمان رجعت اجت غارة ثانية، هذا الجريح كان جريح عم صار شهيد.
Abu Ali is describing a military tactic known as double tap, when the same site is targeted again when emergency workers arrive. It's widely considered a war crime. Under international law, targeting any first responder or health worker not partaking in armed conflict is illegal, even if they're funded or run by fighting groups like Hezbollah. The UN has also accused Israel of targeting medics in its parallel Gaza bombardment. British Palestinian plastic surgeon Ghassan Abu Sitta was there for 3 months.
It's obvious that the destruction of the health system is now a central tenet of Israeli military doctrine. It's obvious that in Lebanon, Israel wants to do what it had done in Gaza, because Israel believes that you can only ethnically cleanse an area if you destroy the health system there, which is a critical component of life. And it's similar tactics. You either target the field hospital directly, and for bigger, high-profile hospitals, what you do is the Israelis have been bombing buildings adjacent.
There are hospitals in Beirut that have also been affected. Do you know what the current situation is at the moment?
So there have been 3 hospitals that have been completely taken out of service. And then the biggest government hospital the area around it has been bombed several times, and now it's under threat.
Have you ever seen anything like this?
I don't think there's been ever a war like this. And with it comes the narrative of militarization and criminalization.
That narrative is often presented on social media. Israeli military spokesperson Avichai Adrai has spread fear and panic with his online posts written in Arabic, which often threaten cities, towns, and neighborhoods in Lebanon and in Gaza. In this video posted by him on X, the Islamic Health Society is accused of storing and transporting weapons in ambulances and hospitals. Another graphic accuses Beirut's Sahel Hospital of storing Hezbollah funds in an underground bunker. Sahel Hospital was forced to close, even though journalists explored every floor and found nothing. And despite no evidence for the allegations against Islamic Health Society workers, many have been killed in Israeli strikes, including here at a health unit in central Beirut.
The second floor of this building belongs to the Islamic Health Society. They say that they use it for members of their team to rest and to recuperate, and they also have clinics inside.
9 people were killed in total, 7 of them were staff, and 2 of them were medics. No prior evacuation warning was given by Israel, and after the attack, no reference to the facility was made. Mohammed Farhat, the centre's manager, was inside the building when it was struck. Can you describe where you were the night of the attack and how it happened?
هون كنت انا نايم، هيدا التخت كنت
نايم
نايم
على هذه؟
هيدا التخت، كنت نايم هون بالضبط. هون كان في الشهيد مصطفى الموسوي كمان كان نايم حده. هون كان في شهيد مهدي الحلباوي كمان كانوا نايمين حده. بصير كل شيء يمرق معك بسرعه، يعني الصوت مع الاحساس مع الوجع مع الصريخ مع الحجاره اللي عم تنزل عليك. حاولت من منقذ لأنا شخص بحاجه للمساعده.
You say that you saw your colleagues as you were taken out. Did you know that they had been killed?
على الساعة 3-4 عرفت إنه كلهم استشهدوا. هون بصير يجيك شعور الخجل، بس إحنا بالآخر ما فينا نتخبى. أنا إذا هالبدلة هي السبب كانت إنه أنا موت أو استشهد أو اتصاب، برجع بلبسها لموت واستشهد واتصاب وأنا لابس هيدي البدلة.
In wartime, rescue workers often live in health units and hospitals. For Hussein Jabir, who's on call 24 hours a day, Nabatiya's hospital has become his home.
واحد من أصعب المشاهد إنك تكوني فايقة متروقة أنت وياه عم تقضوا كل أيامكم مع بعض، فجأة بتوصل على المستشفى وبترجعي بلا. هذا شيء كتير عز علي. شو ذنبه؟ إنه كان عم ينقذ أولاد وأطفال ومدنية، كان عم يقدم لهم الحماية. هيدا الذنب اللي ارتكبه.
The quiet is suddenly interrupted by the sound of missiles.
ثلاث غارات. سامع أنا مشيت على السوق، أغرت السوق هلا. ماشي حبيبي.
We had 2 huge strikes. There was smoke in the distance. We had to wait to get clearance before we set off because that's what happens here. It'll be quiet and then there's a massive attack. These guys have been targeted so many times, the emergency workers in Lebanon, that they have to get clearance before they can set off. The devastation is absolutely huge. There's dust everywhere. And currently, all the emergency workers are searching the site for any survivors. It's still an incredibly dangerous situation because emergency workers previously have been attacked after they've turned up to one of these sites.
رح نتوجه على تاني غارة. يلا. مقاومة الشعب اللبناني لعدو إسرائيل وحدة منها هو الدفاع المدني. وجوده حد الناس روحته على كل غارة مع إنه حيستهدف، هيدا تحدي للعدو، وهذا الشيء يمكن حيخلينا نستهدف مرة تانية وثالثة ورابعة. ما في عنا خيار بديل.
During 14 months of conflict, 330 healthcare workers in Lebanon have been killed by Israel. And as a ceasefire hangs in the balance, emergency workers in Lebanon, like Hussein Jabir, are prepared to continue their work despite the risks.
يلا بعد 12 كيلو صاروا، كمل. بتجيبها أحسن. يلا الحمد لله.
I'm sure this was a lot. This is the reality on the ground, unfortunately. Now I'd like to welcome our panelists, Hind Hassan, Yasmin Ahmad, Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, and Dr. Victoria Rose, chaired by journalist Hind Hassan, senior producer and presenter at Middle East Eye, and also the host of one of Middle East Eye's main shows, Real Talk.
What a powerful doc that was. Feel free to give it up again. Come on. So this is the panel discussion. My guests here need no introduction, but I'm going to introduce them anyway. We have Hind Hassan, an award-winning international journalist and documentary filmmaker who directed and presented the doc. Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, a British Palestinian plastic and reconstructive war surgeon and rector of the University of Glasgow, who worked in hospitals in Gaza and Lebanon during Israel's bombardment of healthcare infrastructure. We have Dr. Victoria Rose, NHS plastic surgeon, who has supported trauma care services in Gaza since 2009. She's the chair of the RCSE, Special Advisory Committee for Plastic Surgery, and volunteer at the European Gaza Hospital in March 2024 and Nasser Hospital in August 2024. And last but definitely not least, we have Yasmin Ahmad, who is the UK Director of Human Rights Watch with 2 decades of experience as a public international lawyer. Welcome, everyone. Yes, yes, come on. Thank you. And I'm going to start with you. You know, powerful doc, but I want you to take us behind the scenes a bit. You were reporting there in Lebanon before any ceasefire. So it was basically at the height of Israeli attacks on Lebanon. So behind the scenes, what were you seeing? What was the atmosphere like?
First of all, thank you for the question. But before we start, I just want to, I find it very difficult to take part in any panel without paying respect to my colleagues in Gaza and all the journalists who are there, who continue to report day in, day out, who continue to be killed with impunity, who are the only ones showing us what is happening there and the devastating impact of the bombardment in Gaza. They have witnessed their homes being destroyed, they've witnessed their families being killed, and yet they continue to report. So I just wanted to, first of all, pay my respect to the ones who've been killed and the ones who remain. And I also want to really, really thank Middle East Eye, because it is a very difficult time for journalists. It's a very important time for these stories to be told, especially from us who have the privilege of going home and sleeping in our warm beds. And so the very fact that there are platforms like Middle East Eye who give us that opportunity to be able to report on these important stories and to platform the voices that you've heard today is just so important. And it's becoming increasingly difficult, and there are increasingly limited number of places that allow us to tell these stories. So thank you to Middle East Eye for that. And in terms of behind the scene, actually, it's very interesting, because when I was trying to get together a team to actually work on this documentary, and by the way, apart from me, the entire team who worked on this were Lebanese, including Abbas Al-Baki, who's here today. He's the field journalist, the field producer who works on this, and it's great that he's here today with us. But a lot of them said to us that the reason why they were willing to work on this documentary was because it was Middle East Eye, because they were feeling so disillusioned with, you know, some of the coverage, and they really did appreciate what Middle East Eye had been doing. But when we were there, I think it was before I went to Lebanon, we were seeing these reports of the high number of emergency workers who had been killed, the allegations of targeted attacks, the report of what is called double tap, which is where, as you saw in the documentary, people will turn up, there'll be an attack, emergency workers will turn up, and then there'll be another strike. And of course, the whole bombardment of Gaza has been bookended by attacks on emergency workers. So we, you know, immediately saw the attacks on the hospitals, and then, you know, we are still watching in real time the aftermath of the 15 Palestinian emergency workers who were killed and then buried in a mass grave. And so even though Lebanon is very, very different to Gaza, it's a different place, you know, it's a different system, different people, but it's the same military. And over the years of working as a journalist, you get to see these patterns, and you get to spot what is the military playbook. And that's something that I thought would be very important to explore. And so when we got there, that was what we immediately started looking into. It was very dangerous. It was very, very dangerous. So, for example, the explosions that you saw, and when we went to the site and it was burning, and there were buildings burning, and you know, the emergency workers were trying to work. I've been in a lot of conflict zones, and it's scary, of course, but usually as journalists, there's some way of protecting ourselves to some extent, obviously not always, but as us international journalists, when we'll go somewhere, you know, we'll stay in a certain hotel, we might have a security team back at base that we can talk to, and you can't always avoid it. And of course, a lot of journalists do get killed. But in this situation, when we went out there and we ended up at a location, we didn't spend much time on the site. We had to leave as quickly as possible. But when we got there and you could hear the drones, they're so loud, I can't describe. They're everywhere. You know, you can hear them at night, you can hear them during the day. And when they're louder, they're scary, because, you know, if there's an Israeli drone, there's a chance of an attack. And so we get to a place, and there's a Hind Hassan, which is the Islamic Health Society, which is affiliated to Hezbollah. And there's also the civil defense. And we know that IHS is specifically targeted. So it was just incredibly scary. You know, there's not many situations where you can go somewhere as a journalist and know that you are sitting ducks, that if you don't get out there, you don't know if you're going to survive. And we had that for a split second. And so you put yourself in the emergency workers' places, they experience that every single day, every single moment. And that's in Lebanon when we got to go and, you know, put a camera there. In Gaza, where international journalists are not allowed in, you have journalists and emergency workers just facing that every single day. And I still don't think I can process how difficult that must be, and the amount of bravery it must take to be able to do that job.
Mm-hmm. There's a chilling moment in the doc where you're speaking to Mohammed Amasha, who is one of the survivors. He's a medic, and he survived an Israeli strike. And you can hear an airstrike, and you raise your finger, and then he just kind of calmly looks at you, and then you just continue the conversation. But just that specific moment, what went through your mind? I mean, what did it reveal to you about the lives of these medics on the ground?
So that happened quite a lot in Dahia. We heard quite a few of those. And just to start, before saying anything, I did speak to Mohammed Amasha's daughter, Noor, who has reported that he's in much better health, that he's doing well, and that they are proud sons and daughters of him, and that they, you know, they were really pleased with the documentary, because I think they were happy that they had a platform to be able to tell their story. But I think just being in that situation and just hearing the bombs fall so close by, it doesn't even do it justice. That sounds, if it's loud on the camera, that means it's incredibly close, because it's much, much louder in real life. And Dahia, parts of Dahia was completely leveled. I mean, that was also the place where they dropped those, multiple bunker busters in a particular area on the 27th of September when they killed the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. But the fact that this family were dealing with what had happened to Muhammad, the death of his colleagues, they're struggling financially, they're living in this home, they're very humble people, and yet there's no reprieve there, and there are bombs still falling around them, and they got on with it. But of course it has a devastating impact on them, and it really does make you focus on just the extreme inhumane experience that they go through. And like I say, I think we don't really appreciate that level of fear or experience. It's almost dystopian.
There's a lot that we're still going to unpack here, but just there's a note that Hind was saying that I'd like to ask Dr. Rose and Dr. Hassan. The idea of drones humming constantly in the background. And I think, Dr. Rose, we spoke about this during our interview a few months back, but I'd like to kind of pick up on it here. What is it that you have to say? Like, do you ever get used to the sound of these drones? I mean, what is it to you when you think of it, when you saw it in that doc?
I think you do get used to it. You do get used to it because you've got so much work to do that sort of occupies you most of the time. And it's awful to say, but I think that the drones and the bombing, you get used to very quickly. I remember the first time that I arrived in the March of last year to the European Gaza Hospital, and we were standing in our accommodation, and we'd been there for, I think, one night, and a bomb went off, and the chap that was looking after us, Mohammed Haneen, was standing next to me, and it blew through the window and it moved the curtains, and I was like, oh. And he said, don't worry, it's at least 5K away. And I just looked at him and I said, that's really close. And he said, no, it's fine. And everyone else in the room was looking at me as if I was crazy to be worried about this. And so very quickly, you suddenly feel out of place, that you need to, stand with them and just do what they're doing. And then within 48 hours, you're hearing it all the time, and you're just working. It's background noise very quickly.
Dr. Hassan, do you want to add anything?
So just to say that Israeli drones still fly over Beirut as we speak. Last week, the cabinet had to suspend its session because the sound of the drone being intentionally flown over the Sarai where the cabinet meets in Lebanon. They've had to stop the meeting, and you still hear the drones, most days in Beirut. The thing about Gaza is that what it has done is it has acclimatized us to a level of violence that has never been seen anywhere. Therefore, for me, moving from Gaza to Beirut, there was a kind of sense, almost that the Lebanon war wasn't, for me, just wasn't as intense. And I even weekends I used to go up to a hospital in Nabatiyah, and during the week I would serve in Dahia around a couple of the hospitals. And I knew that this was wrong, that this sense of disproportion was a pathological sense, that the depravity of the level of intensity of killing in Gaza means that you kind of get used to such a high level that everything else feels slightly more subdued. But one of the saddest things about, even now, working in some of the hospitals in Lebanon, is having, when you go to the kind of, the lounge in the operating room, and there are pictures of their colleagues who were killed from that hospital during the war. And there's very few hospitals in the south or in Beirut where that isn't a feature, where you go in to have your coffee and there's pictures of their dead colleagues. Doctors, nurses, paramedics, all, because what had happened in the south is that Israel, so one of the improvements in trauma care in both Gaza and in Lebanon was these trauma stabilization points and these field hospitals emerging as a result of the experience learned. And so Israel would wipe out these field hospitals in the south, some of whom it took months after the ceasefire for the Israelis to allow the teams to retrieve the bodies of the doctors. I remember a young orthopedic surgeon. It wasn't until almost a month and a half that his family was able to get his body to bury. It's a kind of a level of brutality that kind of beggars belief. And I'll quickly end on that. As someone who's had done this before in Syria and in Iraq and in Yemen, the difference now is finding yourself that you are in the front line by being in a hospital. You're not in a hospital close to the front line. And that's the difference in Gaza and in Lebanon. The hospital is the most dangerous place in the war, because that's the place that Israel likes to target.
Just on that note, Dr. Hassan, what does that suggest about the tactics and the intent behind the strikes in both Gaza and Lebanon? Just that note that you just said about being on the front line.
I think it's obvious that the destruction and the dismantlement of the health system is now a critical and central component of the Israeli military doctrine. It's not a side tactic, but actually that destruction. In terms of how that bodes for the rest of humanity, the question is, are what we seeing? So when we started to hear about scorched earth policy in the 60s and in the Korea War in the 60s and the 70s, the majority of the world's population was rural. And so in order to render a place uninhabitable, you had to burn the crops and the ability of that rural area to support the population. In the 21st century, when the majority of the world's population, particularly the surplus populations in the third world, live in urban environments, the dismantlement of the health system is now a component of scorched earth policy. So in order to render an area uninhabitable, you have to take out the health system in a systematic way. And it's critical to understand that, for people who are not within the health system, a hospital the size of Shifa Hospital, which is Gaza's biggest hospital, can probably be rebuilt in 2 years, 2.5 years. But training the pathologists, there are 5 pathologists in Gaza, and you need to know that there's no such thing as a cancer service without pathologists. There are no surgeries without pathologists. There were 5 pathologists in Gaza. There are only 2 still alive. And it takes 5 years of medical school, 3 or 4 years of internal medicine, and then another 4 or 5 years as a pathologist. So that is the number of years it will take if we start today training a new generation of pathologists. Nephrologists, all 3 board-certified nephrologists have been killed. There are no living board-certified emergency medicine doctors left in Gaza. And the list goes on. And it takes between 8 and 12 years to retrain one of them, which means that Israel really thought this one through. They have thought the process of taking out a whole generation of health workers through to the extent that, in order to rebuild and provide a service, you will need a crutch generation to support you in Gaza until you retrain the new generation of just to go back to the 2023 levels, which were very, very low as a result of 16 years of the siege.
And excuse me, Hind, I'm gonna come back to you and then I'll go to Yasmin. So in the film, Abu Ali talks to you. He's one of the emergency first responders. He talks to you about the double tap strike. I want to ask you about that. First of all, how can we define it? Is it that the Israeli military would strike a place or a location, and then as soon as people start to go in to try to rescue, or emergency first responders try to rescue the injured, another strike hits?
That's right.
Okay. What did you learn about it from your time in Lebanon?
It was before. Before we went to Lebanon, we do our research. You know, we speak to different people. Abbas also did some work on it and some research, and you know, we found that most people that you speak to either have had that experience themselves or know somebody else that has had that experience. And I think there was actually a number of reports. I think The Guardian may have done a report on double tap, but it popped up in a few places, and we'd seen that it was something that was there. And I wanted to know just how much that was going on, and whether that was something that was happening regularly. And speaking to a lot of people, you know, they said that was happening. But then, you know, double tap is one thing, but then you saw with the the IHS building in Beirut, that was in quite a central Beirut location. It wasn't in Lahia, it was in central Beirut, and they hit the exact floor that it was in. I mean, people were killed, I think, in other parts of the building, but that floor was hit. It was a very, very specific. There's no way else that you can say that it wasn't targeted. So as well as seeing, you know, double tap and these like military tactics, we also saw just very direct strikes. And the funeral, the pictures of the funeral that you saw, that was 15 civil defense workers who had been killed in Baalbek. And again, civil defense workers, they are not affiliated to Hezbollah. Even if they are affiliated to Hezbollah, doesn't mean that they can be targeted. It's still against international humanitarian law to target any emergency worker or medic who is not partaking in active combat. And I think that was also one of the similarities that we saw with what's happening in Gaza. And if we just take the 15 medics that have recently been killed, immediately we heard that they were either terrorists or there were terrorists with them. And, you know, that was kind of put out there, but without a lot of detail. So immediately anyone watching that will be like, oh, there was confusion, or there were terrorists there. And it wasn't just, you know, a violation of international humanitarian law and the killing of 15 emergency workers. There were other things going on. And then, you know, there was an investigation actually, which is rare. We don't normally see, you know, vocally Israel saying that they're investigating the killing of emergency workers, unless it's unless they're international aid workers. And so, but even then, there's absolutely no acceptance of any criminal behavior. What was said in the investigation, I think, was something along the lines of there were a number of mistakes that were made, professional mistakes that were made, and the soldiers who were involved didn't report it properly. But there was no criminal accusations that were made. And then the same, what we saw in Lebanon when we were there, was that no matter what happened, there wasn't an investigation, but we did see over and over again these videos that were put online showing militants in ambulances, showing weapons in ambulances, cartoons of them being made. And yet everywhere we went, and it's not just us, it's all the journalists who were there. There were many journalists from all different media and news organizations who all did the same thing and all did their own. Every time there was an allegation, they did their investigation. And there was no evidence that weapons were being carried in ambulances, or that Hezbollah was using emergency workers and hospitals to hide among medics.
And Yasmin, I'm coming to you now. So what does international law say about this, if we're talking about the double tap strategy?
Okay, I think maybe first, just to sort of step back, and
Sure.
particularly in relation to Gaza. So Human Rights Watch, other human rights organizations, the UN, and many other organizations have documented a series of war crimes by Israel on healthcare facilities and medical and healthcare professionals. What we've seen over the last nearly 2 years is a systematic attack against the healthcare facilities and professionals in Gaza. And we've obviously seen that attack replicated in Lebanon as well. We've seen, in addition to unlawful attacks against medical facilities, personnel and transport, we've also seen war crimes that have happened in the context of the occupation of hospitals. We saw that in the context of Nasser Hospital, Al-Shifa, Kamal Adwan Hospital, and on multiple occasions. And what did that look like? That looks like the denial of essential and life-saving supplies and services within those hospitals. So that's electricity, water, medication, food. We have reported on civilians being shot, including medical professionals being shot dead in hospitals, mistreatment of healthcare workers more generally, and the destruction. And as we've seen in this video, we've documented many times, also, which is part of the picture, is the absolute destruction of the healthcare facilities themselves, so that they the almost impossible task of having to rebuild a hospital when you're having constant casualties coming in again and again. And then, I mean, I think what's important to remember is the attacks are not just on the infrastructure and doctors that are in the hospitals, but it also, we've seen, and as we know, the detention and torture of healthcare professionals. And we've seen that there have been tens of healthcare professionals that have been subject to unlawful detention and mistreatment and torture, including reports of sexual violence and other forms of torture. And there are many, as we currently sit here now, that continue to be unlawfully detained in Israel and the occupied territories as well. And then I think sort of overall, so we've obviously got war crimes that have and continue to be committed, but it also fits into the other crimes and is part of the other crimes that Israel is committing, including, as we have said, crimes against humanity of extermination of the Palestinian people in Gaza, as well as genocidal acts. The destruction of the healthcare facility is part of the conditions which Israel is inflicting on the life of the population in Gaza, intentionally depriving them of what is essential for their life, which is the medical facilities and healthcare professionals, and also the medical supplies that are necessary. And we know that there's, for over 50 days now, there's been another blockade. So I think that's, you know, that's the overall picture of what we're seeing in terms of international crimes being committed, of which this is a fundamental part. In terms of sort of zooming then in to the justifications that Israel has given for attacking hospitals, we've seen again and again the narrative from the IDF being that Hamas is using hospitals as, you know, as a site of activity, of military activity, tunnels and other such things. Well, first of all, it's very, very clear under international humanitarian law, absolutely clear, that healthcare facilities and medical professionals and other emergency professionals are protected like any other civilian. But in fact, they have enhanced protection under international humanitarian law. There is a very slim exception of when there is the possibility of actually attacking healthcare facilities. And that is when they are being used to commit acts harmful to the enemy. And let's be very clear. First, there must be evidence that this has happened. But secondly, and this is very important, there must be due warning that is provided and the ability to and facilitation of evacuation of patients and medical personnel from that hospital. Again and again, we have documented incidences where Israel has claimed, without sufficient evidence, that Hamas is operating, but has not followed international humanitarian law in terms of providing sufficient warning and ensuring that evacuations are done in a lawful way. We've seen again and again evacuations being done in instances where people can't be evacuated because they're on you know, either on life support, dialysis, so on and so forth, but also in circumstances where there is no way of people actually leaving. There's no safe way to leave. So I think, and then let's get even past that. International humanitarian law says still that the attack needs to be proportionate. The military gain needs to be proportionate to the damage that's caused to civilians and civilian infrastructure. And one can argue again and again, and no doubt this will be argued before international courts, I hope, and domestic courts when Israeli military officials are before them, is that this in no way is proportionate to destroy the healthcare facilities, given the damage that this does. And what we're seeing in terms of civilian harm in Gaza and deaths in Gaza, and not just those that are a result of direct attacks, but the unquantifiable now deaths that have happened as a result of the fact that A, there's no humanitarian access, but also the fact that there is no healthcare provision for people. So I think, I mean, it's an incredibly distressing situation, and we know that the majority of hospitals in Gaza have been attacked and or destroyed.
Mm-hmm. And what about the strikes on medical personnel? I mean, the justifications that the Israeli military will put out is that these medics are either tied or funded by armed groups.
They are medics that are not the only people that can be that are the subject of attack in an armed conflict of this nature are persons that are actively participating in hostilities or are part of the armed wing of Hamas. So even if they were a medical wing of an armed group, they are still protected. They are still doing a protected function, which is essentially a function of providing medical aid and services to individuals. So there is absolutely no justification under international law. And in fact, obviously, it's a serious violation of international law and potentially, obviously, a war crime if the relevant thresholds are met.
I actually want to open this question to everyone, to the floor, really. What Yasmin was touching on, these accusations against medical facilities, whether in Gaza or Lebanon, when these narratives take over, you know, what is the danger, especially the way that they become the story? And I'm speaking specifically about these accusations. I can start with Hind, and then we can pass it down, or Dr. Hassan.
We'll let the medics go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I mean, I remember the day or the evening at the beginning of the war, if you recall, when the Israeli army had that press conference and they started to show these graphics of tunnels underneath Shifa Hospital. And then the minute that press conference finished, the Israelis then cut off all communication to Gaza and then started bombing Shifa Hospital. So, you know, within an hour of that finishing, the bombing started to happen around the whole of the perimeter and the houses and the neighborhoods that surrounding the hospital, and including the kind of outlying maternity building at Shifa Hospital. And it showed how critically important, and what is the, you know, I mean, in those 2 months that I was there, just under 2 months in the beginning of the war, one of the most distressing and depressing things is the way Western journalists would latch on immediately and unquestioningly to the last outrageous claim that the Israeli army would make. And it becomes the truth that the Palestinian victims have to disprove. So you know, and I remember, you know, I mean, even my colleagues who came after me when, you know, in Deir al-Balah, in Shuhada al-Aqsa, the Israelis claimed that they bombed Shuhada al-Aqsa because a missile came out. The hospital was full of foreign medical teams. But that's it. Everybody's job then becomes to disprove what the Israelis are saying, rather than it's the job of the Israelis to prove what they're saying. So when they say there are tunnels, it's the job of every doctor that speaks to any journalist. It was to disprove that this is true, and it keeps, you know. And once it's proven, I mean, once it's obvious, once they released Dr. Muhammad Abu Salmiya, who was the medical director of Gaza, because they had no evidence to put him in front of a judge, even an Israeli judge. That there's no then reflection by Western media on its behavior leading up to that point. And that's really one of the kind of most depressing parts of having to live through that kind of the fact that you are continuously having to prove your innocence inside the hospital.
And on that specific note, Dr. Hassan, I'd still like you to expand on this, the dangers when these accusations become the story.
The dangers is so in Rome, there used to be something called the homo sacer. And the homo sacer is an individual whose killing whose death is not murder. And so he is the exception within Roman law of murder, because his death is not murder, his killing is not murder. And what the Israelis do is to basically say that that is the Palestinian health worker, that their death is not murder because they are either colluding or actively participating in armed. And we can see that, I mean, in Lebanon, we see that really in a vile way with the pager victims. So you know that Israel booby-trapped over 7,000 pagers. There's 7,000 wounded, 900 have lost both eyes. There's over 50 children. I'm currently seeing 30 children, of whom 2 have lost both eyes. Several have lost an eye or amputated digits. The United States is harassing hospitals that treat them and provide medical care for them, and threatening them with being put on the sanctions list, despite, and this is not transgressing on international law, that even if they were combatants, once they are wounded, it is the job of every health professional to provide medical care for them. So these are critically wounded and disabled people. If we accept Israel's claim that all of the 7,000 were combatants, the minute they're wounded, they are entitled to health care, yet the United States and its embassy in Lebanon is harassing every hospital that dares to treat them.
Dr. Rose, would you like to add to what Dr. Hassan was saying?
I think it's just becoming more and more acceptable. They seem to be denying the facts of what's occurring, and it's becoming more and more acceptable and justifiable in their eyes to continue. I remember in the March, the first time we were out there, when the Central World Kitchen workers were hit and killed, and we had probably 12 hours where the drones stopped. And I remember thinking, oh my God, they must really be worried now, because they've hit a load of foreign nationals that are providing aid. And the following day, it was back to normal, and they had, covered it up, and they continued. And this seems to be a pattern that they're doing, even with the International Red Crescent workers, the 15. It took so long to prove that they had their lights on, that they were performing legitimate work, and that they weren't doing the story that Israel put out at the beginning. And it's exactly what Ghassan says. It's up to us to prove the facts, because everybody just takes what Israel says as the truth.
We're good. Okay. Dr. Rose, I'm actually going to stay with you on this question. I mean, you were supposed to be in Gaza in February of this year.
Yeah.
And you were denied entry. Okay. So I want to speak to you about COGAT. And for those who don't know, COGAT is actually an Israeli unit that deals with the affairs of occupied Palestine. Dr. Rose, you've spoken a bit about it before, and I kind of want to unpack this here. They've basically, since the war has started on Gaza, they've been placing more and more restrictions, which have gotten tighter over time. Now, COGAT, I guess the biggest restriction that they've recently done is that they banned doctors of Palestinian heritage from entering Gaza, volunteering in Gaza. And I think they're also, if I'm not mistaken, they're requiring medics to stay for at least a month.
Yeah, it's at least a month now. So when the war first started, you could deploy for 2.5 weeks. And I think that was mainly the WHO and the United Nations convoys and the logistics of getting people in and out of Gaza on the trips that they have. There's only 2 buses that go in a week on a Tuesday and a Thursday now. And there's only so many seats on the bus. And as the war has progressed, the number of seats on the bus has decreased. So when we went in August, there were only 25 seats on the bus, and that has to cover all of the aid workers. So that's not just the charities that provide doctors, that is OCHA, United Nations, that's all that staff that are doing bomb disposal work. We had a chap with us on the bus that was tracking viruses, doing all that sort of work. So people that need to be in there, but not necessarily all doctors. And when Graham and I went in August, we were the only 2 surgeons on a bus of 25. And it was quite worrying, the situation when we got there, that was the limit. When the ceasefire happened, we were told momentarily that the bus would increase the number of passengers to 55. And we had a brief few weeks of exultation when we thought that we would get more of our charity team members in. And that seemed to coincide with a period that we were out in the February where a huge number of doctors were going out thinking that they would get a seat on the bus, and the majority of them would be denied. So when we went in February, we were a team of 4 out of 44 people who had got to Amman to get on the convoy, and only 22 people were allowed access on that trip, and only 2 of them were doctors.
And this idea of, I guess, the minimum requirement that you have to stay there for a month, I guess when you're a medical professional, when you're a doctor, it's quite hard to take unpaid leave for a month, isn't it?
It's exceptionally hard to take unpaid leave, because the people that you want in Gaza right now are the people that are doing this in their day jobs, the people that actually see trauma on the ground in London, that are dealing with, massive open limb trauma. And these people have jobs in the NHS. So to take a month off is exceptionally difficult. And, it has been really hard to take a month off and then come back after a week and ask your hospital to give you all your annual leave back when they've cancelled all your operating and all your clinical commitments. But it's not just the timing, it's a million restrictions that they've put on us. You have to take enough water for 3 days, you have to take all your own food with you. You are only allowed one bag that weighs 23 kilograms. You're not allowed to take anything more than that with you. You have to have a sort of an emergency plan. So you have to have a driver 24/7 so that you can get out of the hospital. You're not allowed to rely on the local staff. You are only allowed a finite amount of money to take in with you. And that, for us, that has to pay for all of our food, accommodation. We then would hire a driver, a Palestinian, to be at the hospital 24/7 in case we needed to leave. We also then, have to pay lots of the staff that are helping us, looking after us. And now that money has dropped to such an extent that we can't really cover the bus fare in and out, let alone the money that we're going to need to survive when we're in Gaza. It's become impossible. Absolutely impossible.
The reason why I was hung up on the timing is because I wanted to ask you if you saw this as basically COGAT's way of deliberately making it harder for volunteers to go to Gaza, basically to restrict the amount of volunteers that would go in through these kind of stipulations.
I think every step they've made has been to make it more difficult. Every time we go, there's some new ruling that makes it harder for us to stay in and survive when we're in there.
Dr. Hassan, I want to go to you because you had not only a similar experience, but you were recently banned from the Schengen area as well because of Germany, and I believe it was to give witness testimony. Can you dwell on this experience for us?
I mean, I think in order to understand why we're here 18 months since the beginning of the genocide, we need to see the genocide enablement apparatus and the institutions that have enabled the genocide, and the practices and the policies that aim to silence those who bear witness or those who oppose. And these bans were part of that, in addition to attacks on medics trying to have their medical licenses withdrawn. UK Lawyers for Israel, I think, has 64 complaints at the General Medical Council trying to have doctors' medical licenses removed, including myself, with 2 complaints from UK Lawyers for Israel. That process, in addition to the attempts by the German government to silence me and then to have me silenced all over Schengen so I can't make it back to The Hague, is part of that process of silencing that has effectively allowed the genocide to continue for 18 months. It's an enablement process. And it's interesting, there was a pediatrician who had been to Gaza and who's an expert in child physical and sexual abuse. And she was saying that, you know, in all cases of child abuse, whether they're individual or they're genocidal like Gaza, there's not just the perpetrator, but there is a whole system of enablement that allow the abuser to carry on for as long as they have. And when she said that, it makes sense. In order to get away with killing 18,000 children, maiming with amputations around 4,000 to 6,000 other children, 300 children with quadcopter drone sniper injuries with traumatic brain injury and spinal cord injury, you need a system of enablement like any other form of child abuse. And that system is the BBC, is the medical establishment, you know, all of these things. And that's how you can sustain a genocide that's been watched by people for 18 months.
Yasmin, I'm going to come back to you from, I guess, from everything that we've seen in this documentary, the material and everything else. How much of this do you think is a case that can be built against the Israeli military, or the Israeli government as well? And what I mean here is that a case that speaks specifically to the notion that this is a war on medics and that they are being deliberately targeted.
Yeah, well, obviously there is a case before the ICC, and there are arrest warrants out against Netanyahu and Gallant. And that arrest warrant is specifically in relation to their blocking of humanitarian aid and the war crimes and crimes against humanity that are alleged against them for doing that, essentially collectively punishing the entire Palestinian population. In terms of the specific attacks on hospitals, I mean, I think obviously in each individual instance, there would need to be, and I mean, there's a growing body now, obviously, of evidence of attacks. And obviously in many instances, there will potentially also be evidence of either there being direct attacks and or it being reckless, of which it then amounts to a war crime. But I think essentially it will be about, I think first of all, it's about obviously ensuring that there's sufficient evidence, of which many organizations, including Human Rights Watch, but many others, are gathering. And then it's thinking about being able to have a forum for those cases to be brought. So obviously the ICC is one forum, but there are also obviously domestic jurisdictions that also will have the ability to try Israeli officials for crimes that they have committed, including the crimes against healthcare facilities and healthcare workers. And obviously, in addition to the attacks on hospitals and attacks directly on healthcare workers, there's obviously also the crimes that are being committed in relation to unlawful detention and torture as well of healthcare professionals. So, I mean, I think there is certainly, I mean, it will be obviously on a case-by-case basis, and there would need to be evidence against either an individual who has committed it or those that were in command and control. And I think that's really important, is that this is not only about the officials on the IDF as soldiers who are committing these crimes on the ground or via the drones, or that are manning the F-35s that are dropping these 1,000-ton bombs, but it is also those that are in command and control. And so those senior officials that have oversight of this, and I think the world will be and should be getting a lot smaller for those individuals for what they have done. And I very much hope that there is the evidence that is brought to either international or domestic courts that holds officials, both high level and those that are carrying out, to account for what is being done. Because as we've said, this is a systematic attack, which is not just about, it is, I mean, I think what's really important, and as has been noted, this is about the individual healthcare professionals who sit in detention right now in Israel for merely doing their job. It's about the young amputees who are sitting in, who were, for example, in last Easter. I spent my Easter desperately trying to find a way of getting a 13 and a 14-year-old out of Al-Shifa Hospital, both of whom were amputees who had maggots through all of their wounds and who were so severely malnourished they probably had one of them at least had a couple of days left of life, and there was no way of getting them out. But it's also about, as we've said, this is actually part of something much bigger, and that's also where we're talking about these serious international crimes of which states have universal jurisdiction. So they are war crimes, but crimes against humanity and genocide.
You know, a question that gets asked time and again is, why can't we be applying international law? I think we all understand the politics aspect of it, the fact that, you know, Israel is backed by the US and other major Western powers. But at the end of the day, isn't international law all we've got? Is there no way to truly protect it and uphold it?
Well, I mean, I think, as you said, the first thing to say about the situation in Gaza and in Lebanon as well, southern Lebanon, is this is not just a situation about states not upholding international law, either those that have the obligations that are the armed forces and the non-state armed groups. This is not just a situation about that. This is a situation of direct complicity by a number of other states, obviously the US directly, but a number of other states who are directly complicit and are facilitating the carrying out of this, because this would not be happening. And it's not just diplomatic cover that we're talking about. We're also talking about providing the arms that are allowing this to happen. I mean, so there's direct complicity from states. This would not be happening without their direct complicity. In terms of international law, unfortunately, there is no international, police force that can. But international law is actually on the basis of reciprocity, and also on the basis that, as we've said, what this does is it means in this context, the double standards that are being applied by the US, the UK, Europe, and many others are then easily applied by Russia in the context of Ukraine, are easily applied by China in the context of the human rights violations that they're carrying out. So by allowing this to happen and by shielding Israel and Israeli forces from accountability and by facilitating this, states are undermining, states who have always been hypocritical, but states who were traditionally the ones that were promoting human rights in some context, undermining the very fabric of international law. And we saw that also in terms of accountability. We had the arrest warrants and then the, equivocal response, some of which was, we are not going to arrest Netanyahu if they come, obviously, and Hungary saying we're going to withdraw from the ICC, and then others saying, oh, it's for the courts to decide. No, you're a signatory to the ICC. It is very clear that if this individual comes to the UK, you have to give effect to that arrest warrant. So I think it is a very serious moment for international law and for states, because international law provides the security for states. Both in context of Russia as well as in the context of the Middle East.
Dr. Hassan, if I can actually come to you on that, your views on protecting and upholding international law.
I mean, I think what we're witnessing now is what we've warned about from the very beginning, is that this genocide is a vehicle with which fascism is going to return to the global north. And we've seen how the complicity of liberal political elites in allowing and aiding the genocide means that they have completely given up on the post-Second World War, even a hypocritical arrangement that there is such a thing as the rule of law. And once they did that, it became much easier for a return of new and old organizations and parties and political movements that are fascistic, that are anti-humanist. So the discourse becomes easier. If you allow the killing of 18,000 children, then anti-humanist discourse becomes easier everywhere else. If you sit and watch people being slaughtered for 18 months, it becomes easier for fascism to make a case because you have gotten people used to it. And this is what we're watching. And it's embarrassing to talk anything historical in front of Professor Schleim, but today I was thinking the Pied Noir were critical to the re-election of Charles de Gaulle with the members of the right in France. But even Charles de Gaulle, at some moment, made the decision that it either was going to be the future of France or the future of the settler colony, and gave up on the future of the settler colony in Algeria. And I think, and I wish, and I hope that the Western metropole of this settler colony comes to a similar historical moment where the corrosion of all of the institutions and to the essence of the rule of law, when you have a prime minister who used to be the attorney general sniggering at the idea that he allowed a fugitive to escape an arrest warrant, it shows you that a local national law is eroded once international law is eroded. That corrosion and that rot that de Gaulle decided to prevent by giving freedom to the Algerians and ending settler colony in Algeria, that Western leaders come to a similar conclusion before it's too late, before not only is international law become obsolete, but even national laws become obsolete. And we see that already. It is against British law for any British national to join an army that is at war, yet the government refuses to uphold that law. And it is a law that exists. I think the only country that upholds that law is Canada, but it exists in France. So all of these European soldiers who have fought in the Israeli army, the national law is being suspended, not the international law, to protect them. And that is just an example of the way the genocidal project has eaten at the heart of the ideas and the institutions that were built in Europe, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, particularly after the Second World War.
So we're actually coming to the end of our discussion here before we open up to the floor for a Q&A. However, Dr. Hassan, again, I want to leave the last word with you, if I may. So in 2003, as you were treating patients in Gaza, this is what you said, quote, "These people are going to be shot at again. Their homes demolished. What we do is treat the symptoms. The disease is the occupation." Now, 22 years later, in light of everything today, how do you revisit this quote?
I think not just that moment. We need to look back for the genocidal logic that existed in Zionism from the very beginning. And I think there are for me, two critical components. Unlike other settler colonial projects like South Africa, Zionism, to its economic detriment, prevented its economic enterprises from becoming dependent on Palestinian labor. And so intentionally from the very beginning, unlike South Africa, which viewed South African labor as part of the resources, the supporters of the early Zionist movement made sure that there was no need for Palestinian labor. Two, the idea of a land without a people is about racial unseeing. That for the Israelis and the Zionists, it was a land without a people because they couldn't see us. They could not see us. And because they can't see us, they're killing us in a genocidal way, because that racial unseeing makes that land empty of recognizable human beings. And that's why it was a land without a people, because they weren't seen as other human beings. And now we see how that logic of elimination that Professor Schleim spoke about, that Patrick Wolf spoke about, has crossed the genocidal Rubicon. And that now, with what we're seeing in the West Bank, with over 55,000 displaced, the destruction of Jenin refugee camp, Tulkarm refugee camps, now in Nablus, that Rubicon will continue. It will continue in Palestine, in South Lebanon, in the Golan Heights in Syria, and what Benny Morris said that that Zionism needed to correct was to complete the emptying of Palestine, because that was the mistake of 1948.
Please join me in thanking our guests tonight, Hind Hassan, Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, Dr. Victoria Rose, Yasmin Ahmed. Thank you so much. We are opening the floor up for questions. There are revolving mics around, I believe. Yes, there are. So hands up. If I may ask for you just to say your name, and if you have a specific guest or panelist that you'd like the question to be directed to. Yes. Yes, hi.
Hello, good evening. Thank you so much for your bravery, Dr. Hassan and everybody else. I'm a retired detective from the Metropolitan Police. I work for the Liberal Democrats under Ed Davis constituency, and I'm from Lib Dems Friends of Palestine. Recently, we're running out of ideas. Well, I have. We're starting to have a divestment in Kingston. I'm running out of ideas. What else can we do to help with the Palestinian cause?
I mean, for me, the most important thing we need to do now is look at mechanisms for pursuing justice in local courts. The kind of work that the Hind Rajab project is doing, the kind of work that the ICJP is doing, is absolutely critical. They want us to give up on the rule of law. That's the corrosion that genocide will bring, is that we stop trying. Even if we get them on tax evasion, that is what we should be trying to do. And so it is critical that every legal avenue to criminalize those, because at the end, I mean, you know, these are murders. They're murders on a horrific scale, but they're still murders. And they need to be, the murderers and the chain of command need to be pursued in local courts, because they control access to international law does not mean that we cannot use national law. And that's one of the things that we need to be pursuing.
Yeah, please, Yasmin, go ahead.
Yeah, look, I think absolutely right that accountability is absolutely key. I think also continuing to push on the UK government to stop all arms sales to Israel, and in particular the F-35s that they're continuing to sell and send into this F-35 supply pool, despite the government themselves acknowledging that those F-35s, that there's a clear risk that those components will be used by the IDF to carry out serious violations of international humanitarian law, and yet they continue to provide that, and on a very, very flimsy legal basis. I think also pushing the government to implement the ICJ advisory opinion, which is very, very clear that the occupation is unlawful and sets out very clearly not only what the obligations are for Israel, but on third states. There's a specific provision in the ICJ advisory opinion that says that third states need to do a number of things. I mean, our country, you know, the UK has not even banned settlement goods. Now, I mean, we're so far past that, but they should be looking at the way that the UK government and companies that are registered in the UK continue to facilitate the unlawful occupation. And so there's a whole, and then obviously, I think, you know, direct advocacy, and as you talked about in relation to investments, but also companies that are profiting from what continues to happen. I think, you know, none of these things, and I mean, obviously, a lot of people ask me, what can we do to stop this? The person that can stop this is the President of the United States, and he's going exactly the opposite direction. But that does not mean that we don't stop, because I think it's critical that there is a counterbalance against that, and also that there's pressure on companies, that there is pressure on institutions, and that we continue to push other states. And then Germany is the second biggest supplier. The UK continues to supply. We need to be pushing states to not be complicit and then taking on their responsibilities to end the unlawful occupation.
Did I see a hand there, here? Yes. Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, you talked about accountability, and this thing's called Israel's war on medics.
There's a mic coming to you. There's a mic coming to you. There it is.
Thank you. Okay, I can stand up. Did you say? Okay, brilliant. Yes, you talked about, I mean, the film is called Israel's War on Medics, but there's also something happening here which is around accountability, which is Zionism's war on medics and on anybody who speaks up for what is happening. And I suppose I'd like to hear from the doctors about their experience of being very high profile medics who are clearly, you know, doing what they can on this, and to some degree will be perceived as taking a side. So I'm sort of interested in what your experience is. You know, maybe that's a hard question to answer because you're still working in the NHS and whatever, but hospital trusts, the BMA, the GMC, and the medical profession as a whole, how it's been responding in this country.
Had it as bad as Ghassan has had it, but I can honestly say that the majority of the people that I work with and the general public I deal with on a day-to-day basis are very pro-Palestinian. And I don't think we can forget that. There is a huge amount of support in the UK for the Palestinian people. And unfortunately, the UK government doesn't seem to be representing that very large voice. Personally, I think I have lost one patient who wrote me a very lovely letter saying that, you know, due to what was happening, she felt that she couldn't carry on under my care. And apart from that, I haven't really had any backlash from the medical profession. The problem for me has been denial into Gaza by Israel to go back and, you know, do the work that we're trying to do.
Dr. Hassan?
I mean, I think, as Victoria said, that the attack on healthcare has had has created an awakening within the health profession, not just in the UK, but across the globe, in which thousands of health workers have either mobilized locally or tried to join the organizations that are providing humanitarian care in Gaza. And I think there's a level of outrage amongst people who had not been politicized by virtue of that attack on the profession, by virtue of the infringement on what was considered sacred, which is the provision of healthcare. The institutions have failed to show that kind of moral courage, and therefore that's what's missing. What's missing is the institutions that should be representing the profession, so that we stand up to those who now think that the critical component. You see, the thing is that it happens at a very granular level. This war will be taught in military academies across the globe, and the effects of the attacks on health facilities and the destruction of the health sector. Then it becomes a norm, a taught doctrine within the conduct of war, if it's allowed to happen. And that's what will happen.
Yes. Yes, sir. Hussein, mic here, please.
My name is Ahmed Lotfi. I'm 70 years old and I'm a retired doctor. Thank you for the speakers tonight, and I would like especially to thank Professor Schleim, who made it clear for us about the Israeli state and the Israeli soldiers. They colonize and they kill the others in Palestine. And because they came with a Zionist movement, which would like to occupy from Egypt to Iraq, including Saudi Arabia, this will happen in West Bank, in Egypt, in Iraq, in Syria, in Gulf countries, with major impact on the region, major impact on the world. When can we come with a serious movement to our government to cut all political, financial, economical, military relationship with this fascist and Zionist state in UK, which could be led by our guest speakers today? Thank you.
Is there a specific panelist?
This mainly goes to Jasmine, Dr. Abu Setta, and Professor Schleim. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Well, Professor, we'll get to you. We'll get to you, Professor Schleim. No, we'll give you a mic. We'll bring you on the panel. We'll make an exception.
Absolutely.
But Yasmin, do you want to start?
I'd love to hear from.
All right, let's do it. Where's the mic?
I feel you are much better qualified than I am. So.
The level of British support for Israel is quite absurd. I'll give you just one example. There is the 2030 UK-Israel agreement, and it's a trade agreement which covers lots of areas of cooperation between the two countries. But there are three items which are quite extraordinary. It says the UK government will oppose the referral of Israel to the International Criminal Court. What business does Britain have to interfere with the independence of the ICC? But it's there in black and white. And secondly, it says the UK government would oppose and work against BDS in this country. BDS is a global grassroots movement. It's non-violent. I emphasize non-violent, and all its main demands are enshrined in international law. So what business does the British government have to work against BDS and to criminalize BDS? And thirdly, and this is perhaps the most bizarre, it says the UK government would work against an excessive focus on Israel at the United Nations. It's Israel that causes the excessive, in my view, not excessive attention of the UN. And yet, this is how totally uncritical the the Conservative government had been through 14 years in power. But the present government, and particularly Starmer, is no better. Starmer defined himself as a Zionist without qualification. No politician should be without qualification about anything. So he doesn't hold Israel to the same standards that he should hold everyone else. So his support for Israel is uncritical and unqualified, and it doesn't depend, it's not conditional on Israel respecting Palestinian human rights or international law. And then there is David Lammy, who was asked, is Israel guilty of genocide? And he said, no, genocide is a legal concept, and we have to wait for a court of law to pronounce, where he's flat wrong. Genocide doesn't need to wait for a court of law to pronounce. We know that Israel is committing genocide, and in any case, the ICJ has come very close to saying that Israel is committing genocide. So here is another example of a British politician who is also a lawyer, and yet when it comes to Israel, he makes an exception, and it's this Israeli exceptionalism that is the source of all the problems we've been discussing.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Okay. Yes, ma'am. The lady over there, please.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists and to Professor Schleim. I'm Amy, and my question, I think all the reflections have been really important about what we can do, whether it is through legal actions, whether it is through continued pressure on government, on divestment, etc. What I'm interested in is understanding what's actually happening inside Israel, because I think Professor Schleim, you talked in the beginning, and Dr. Hassan, you also mentioned that every imperialist state, every settler colonial at this stage gets more and more violent, but eventually it will implode upon itself in some ways. Are we getting anywhere close to that? Because the media is also not covering, Western media is also hiding what is actually happening inside Israel proper. And is there any hope there? And that's to Professor Schleim and anybody else.
Well, is there anyone on the panel that wants to?
I think that
You're a popular guy, man. You're a popular guy. Maybe we should trade seats.
Israel is on the road to fascism. It's not a fully fledged fascist state. The present Israeli government was democratically elected, but so was the Nazi Party in Germany, so was the Fascist Party in Italy. So the fact that a government is democratically elected doesn't mean that it goes on to behave like a fascist state. And Israel today has many of the characteristics of fascism. The belief that might is right, the reliance of militarism, unbridled militarism, total indifference to international law, total indifference to world public opinion. This kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated in any other country, but it is tolerated in the case of Israel. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine exposed very starkly the Western double standards. Russia was immediately condemned and sanctioned for the invasion of Ukraine. When Israel has started perpetrating genocide in Gaza, the Western powers remain silent and even denied that. So the position in Israel is that, as I said in my talk, for the last 25 years, there's been a shift to the right, and this government is representative of Israeli public opinion. It's some more extreme in many cases, but it is representative of Israeli public opinion. And Israel, since the beginning, benefited hugely from international sympathy and support because it was supposedly an island of democracy in a sea of authoritarianism. It most clearly, most emphatically, isn't a democracy today. It's an apartheid state, and therefore it's bound to lose international support. Now there is a disconnect between, as many of us have said, a disconnect between public opinion in the world, in this country, in Europe, everywhere else, and the governments. Public opinion is overwhelmingly and increasingly supportive of the Palestinians and angry, extremely angry with what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. And in the long run, foreign policy is bound to catch up with public opinion. And there are already signs of that. Ireland recognized Palestine, Norway, Spain, Slovenia. So governments are waking up and looking at the reality and changing their position and recognizing Palestine. But when Ireland recognized Palestine, Israel closed down the embassy in Dublin. Not that they could care less about not having an Israeli embassy in Palestine. But if Britain and France recognized Palestine, Israel wouldn't be able to close down its embassies here or in Paris, and this could start a trend, this would become a trend of other countries recognizing Palestine.
You know what? This was awesome. Thank you so much for coming out. We're gonna wrap it up right here. Again, I want to thank our amazing panelists: Hind Hassan, Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, Dr. Victoria Rose, Yasmin Ahmed. Our keynote speakers: David Hurst, Professor Avi Schleim,